I found my wife's diary by accident while looking for insurance papers. One sentence destroyed 28 years of marriage. I don't feel anything for him anymore. But instead of confronting her, I did something much worse. I became invisible, gathered evidence, and planned the perfect revenge. My name is Arthur Blackwood, but everyone calls me Art. I'm 57 years old, and I've been running Blackwood's motor service for the past 23 years. It's not glamorous work, but it's honest. I fix things that are broken, and people pay me for it. Simple transaction, no lies, no deception, just good old-fashioned problem solving with my hands. I married Eleanor 28 years ago when she was a secretary at the county clerk's office, and I was just starting out as a mechanic. She was beautiful then, still is, with those sharp green eyes and that smile that could make you forget your own name. We had our son Edward when she was 25, and for a long time, we were happy, really happy. Eleanor moved up in the world faster than I did. While I was content getting my hands dirty under car hoods, she went back to school, got her accounting degree, and landed a job at Coleman & Sons Construction. Good money, benefits, respect. I was proud of her, genuinely proud. Never occurred to me that success might change her in ways I wouldn't like. The first real sign something was off came about 6 months ago. I was looking for our insurance papers after a fender bender customer claimed we damaged his paint job. Eleanor always kept important documents in her desk drawer upstairs, organized like a military operation. That's when I found the credit card statement. Tiffany & Company, Nordstrom, some fancy spa in the city I'd never heard of. Nearly £8,000 in charges over 3 months. When I asked her about it, Eleanor didn't even blink. "I've been treating myself," she said, not looking up from her laptop. "I work hard, Art. I deserve nice things." The way she said my name, like it tasted sour in her mouth. That should have been warning enough. But I'm a simple man. I fix engines, not marriages. So, I nodded and went back to my garage, telling myself she was right. She did work hard. She did deserve nice things. What I didn't know then was that those nice things weren't for our home or our life together. They were for someone else entirely. Someone who apparently appreciated French lingerie and expensive jewelry more than I ever could. The diary changed everything. I wasn't snooping, not really. I was looking for the checkbook to pay our property taxes. And there it was, sitting on top of a stack of mail like it wanted to be found. Brown leather cover, slightly worn at the edges. I'd seen it plenty of times before, but never thought to look inside. I wish I never had. The first entry I read wasn't even about me. It was about her day at work, complaining about Frederick Coleman making everyone stay late for some budget meeting. Normal wife stuff. The kind of thing she used to tell me over dinner instead of writing down in secret. I almost closed it right there. Almost put it back where I found it and walked away. But something made me flip back a few pages, and that's when I saw my name. Art came home early today. Eleanor had written in her neat handwriting. Found me on the phone with Dee. Had to make up some story about talking to Mom. Getting tired of all the lying. But what choice do I have? Art wouldn't understand. He's too simple for complicated feelings. Too simple. That hit me like a sledgehammer to the chest. 28 years of marriage, and my wife thought I was too simple to understand her complicated feelings. I kept reading even though every word felt like swallowing broken glass. Entry after entry about someone called Dee. How he made her laugh. How he understood her ambitions in ways I never could. How being with him made her feel alive again after years of feeling dead inside. Then I found the entry that stopped my world cold. I don't feel anything for Art anymore. She'd written just 3 weeks ago. Not hate, not love, nothing at all. He's like furniture that I've gotten used to having around. When I try to imagine growing old with him, I feel empty, like I'm already buried. I sat there in that chair for probably an hour, just staring at those words. My wife, the woman I'd built my whole life around, thought of me as furniture, something to be used and ignored until it was time to replace it with something better. The worst part wasn't even the betrayal. It was realizing she was right about one thing. I had been simple. Simple enough to trust her completely. Simple enough to work 70-hour weeks so she could have nice things. Simple enough to never question why she suddenly needed so many new clothes or why she started wearing makeup to run errands. But simple doesn't mean stupid, and it sure doesn't mean weak. I closed the diary and put it back exactly where I found it. Then I went down to my workshop in the basement and started planning. Not revenge. That's what simple men do when they're angry. I was going to do something much more sophisticated. I was going to disappear from her life as completely as she'd already disappeared from mine. And she was going to find out exactly how it felt to lose something you thought would always be there. The next morning, Eleanor came downstairs in a new outfit I'd never seen before. Black skirt, silk blouse, heels that cost more than most people's car payments. She kissed my cheek like always, but now I knew it was just part of her performance. "Working late again tonight," she said, pouring coffee into a travel mug. "Big presentation tomorrow." "Sure thing," I replied, not looking up from my newspaper. "I'll grab something at Murphy's Diner." She paused at the door, and for just a second, I thought she might say something real, something honest. But she just smiled that practice smile and walked out to her BMW. After she left, I called Malcolm Shaw, my old army buddy who'd gone into private investigation after his divorce. Time to start gathering some facts. Malcolm Shaw looked older than his 62 years when he walked into my shop that Tuesday morning. 20 years as a cop, then 15 as a private investigator will do that to a man. But his eyes were still sharp. And when I handed him the photos of Eleanor I'd printed from Facebook, he studied them like he was memorizing every detail. "How long you been married to this woman?" Malcolm asked, setting the pictures on my workbench next to a carburetor I was rebuilding. 28 years this October, I told him. We were supposed to renew our vows for our 30th. "She's already started planning the party." Malcolm made a sound that might have been a laugh if it wasn't so bitter. "Yeah, well, maybe hold off on ordering the cake. What exactly do you want to know?" I explained about the diary, the credit card charges, the late nights at work. Malcolm listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding like he'd heard it all before. When I finished, he pulled out a small notebook and started writing. "Standard surveillance package runs about £1,500 for a week," he said. "That'll get you photos, locations, times, dates. If she's meeting someone regularly, I'll find out who and where." "Money's not the issue," I replied. "I just need to know how deep this goes before I make my move." Malcolm studied my face for a long moment. "Art, I've been doing this for a while now, and I've seen men in your situation handle things all kinds of ways. Some of them do stupid things they regret later. You planning on doing anything stupid?" I thought about that question while I wiped grease off my hands with an old rag. Was planning to systematically dismantle my wife's life stupid? Maybe, but it felt a lot smarter than begging her to love me again or pretending I hadn't read what she really thought of me. "I'm planning to protect myself," I said, finally. "Make sure when this is over, I'm not the one left with nothing." "Good answer," Malcolm said, closing his notebook. "I'll start tomorrow. Give me a week and you'll know everything there is to know about your wife's extracurricular activities." That evening, Eleanor came home at 9:30, claiming she grabbed dinner with some girlfriends after work. She was wearing a new necklace, a delicate silver chain with a small diamond pendant. When I complimented it, she said she'd bought it for herself as a reward for landing a big client. "You deserve nice things," I told her, meaning it in ways she couldn't possibly understand. Later, as she slept beside me, I stared at the ceiling and made plans, not just for the divorce, but for everything that would come after. The house, the business, the retirement account we'd been building for 30 years. She thought I was too simple to understand complicated feelings, but she was about to learn that simple doesn't mean defenseless. Edward called on a Thursday morning while I was installing a new transmission in Mrs. Patterson's Honda. My son's voice sounded different, older, more confident than the last time we talked. "Success will do that to a man." "Dad, I've got some news," Edward said, and I could hear the excitement he was trying to contain. "Clara and I are engaged. We're thinking about having the wedding next spring, maybe." I should have been happy. Edward had been dating Clara Ashton for 3 years, and she was a good woman, smart, kind, came from a solid family. But all I could think about was how this news was going to complicate everything with Eleanor. "That's wonderful, son," I managed. "Your mother's going to be thrilled. Actually, that's why I'm calling. We want to come up this weekend and tell you both in person. Maybe have a family dinner." Start talking about wedding plans. Family dinner. The irony wasn't lost on me. In a few weeks, there might not be a family left to have dinner with. Of course, I said, your mother loves planning parties. This will give her something exciting to focus on. That was the understatement of the year. Eleanor had been talking about Edward's eventual wedding since he graduated college. She had opinions about everything from venues to flower arrangements, all carefully noted in a notebook she kept hidden like it was classified information. When I told Eleanor about the engagement that evening, her reaction was exactly what I expected. She screamed with joy, immediately started making lists, began calling venues even though it was past 9 o'clock. For the first time in months, she looked genuinely happy. This is going to be the wedding of the century, she said, pacing around the kitchen with her phone pressed to her ear. Clara's father owns those car dealerships, so money won't be an issue. We can do something really special. I watched her plan our son's future while destroying our past, and something cold settled in my chest. She was already spending money we might not have by the time this was over, making promises she might not be able to keep. But I didn't say anything. Let her plan. Let her get excited. Let her imagine a future where she was still part of our family. It would make the truth hurt that much more when it finally came out. Malcolm called the next morning with his first report. Eleanor had indeed worked late the night before, but not at Coleman and Sons Construction. She'd been at the Marriott downtown, room 847, with a man Malcolm described as tall, dark hair, expensive suit, drives a black Mercedes. Got photos, Malcolm said. Want me to keep following, or have you seen enough? Keep following, I told him. I need to know everything. Edward and Clara arrived Friday evening in his new Audi. All smiles and nervous energy. Clara was prettier than her photos, with blonde hair and the kind of genuine warmth that made you feel like family immediately. Under different circumstances, I would have been proud to call her my daughter-in-law. Mr. Blackwood, she said, giving me a hug that felt real. Edward talks about you all the time. He says you taught him everything he knows about fixing things. Not everything, I replied, thinking about the one thing I couldn't fix, my marriage, but enough to keep him out of trouble. Eleanor practically glowed during dinner. She'd spent all day cooking. Edward's favorite meal, pot roast with all the trimmings, and the house smelled like the old days when we were actually happy. She peppered Clara with questions about wedding plans, taking notes in a small leather-bound book like she was planning a military operation. June weddings are beautiful, Eleanor said, refilling Clara's wine glass. The weather's perfect, and all the flowers are in bloom. Have you thought about Venice? Clara and Edward exchanged glances. Actually, we were hoping to keep it small, Edward said carefully. Maybe the country club, just immediate family and a few close friends. Small. Eleanor's fork paused halfway to her mouth. Edward, this is your wedding. It should be a celebration, not a courthouse ceremony. I watched my wife plan a wedding for a marriage that might outlast her own, and the irony burned in my throat like cheap whiskey. She was so concerned with Clara's happiness, so focused on creating the perfect day for someone else while destroying the foundation of our son's family home. Later that evening, after Edward and Clara had gone to bed in the guest room, Eleanor sat at the kitchen table surrounded by wedding magazines and printouts for venue websites. She looked content in a way I hadn't seen in months. They're perfect for each other, she said without looking up from a photo of some elaborate floral arrangement. Edward is going to be such a good husband. He learned from watching us, I said, testing the words. Eleanor finally looked at me, and for just a moment, something flickered in her eyes. Guilt, maybe, or regret. But then she smiled and went back to her planning. We did something right, she said softly. The next morning, Malcolm called while I was making coffee. Edward and Clara had gone for a run, and Eleanor was still sleeping off the wine from dinner. Got more pictures, Malcolm said quietly. Your wife's boyfriend left his hotel room at the Hampton Inn yesterday morning. Kissed her goodbye in the parking lot like they were newlyweds. Send them to my secure email, I told him, stepping out onto the back porch where no one could overhear. Keep following him, too. I want to know everything about Dominic Reed. Already on it, Malcolm replied. Guy's got expensive taste for someone who's supposedly just a mid-level manager. That Mercedes is brand new and his apartment downtown isn't cheap. After hanging up, I stood on the porch watching the sunrise and thinking about timing. Edward's engagement should have been the happiest news I'd received all year. Instead, it was just another complication in an increasingly complex situation. When Eleanor finally came downstairs, she was already dressed and ready for another day of wedding planning. She kissed my cheek like we were still the happy couple Edward and Clara believed us to be. I thought we'd take them to look at venues today, she said. The Riverside Country Club has an opening in June. Sounds perfect, I said, meaning it in ways she couldn't understand. Monday morning brought more revelations than I was prepared for. Malcolm's full report arrived in my email, along with photographs that made my stomach turn. Eleanor and Dominic Reed weren't just having an affair. They were living like a married couple during their hotel stays. Room service dinners, shared showers, morning coffee on the balcony like they owned the world. But the financial information Malcolm had dug up was what really got my attention. Dominic Reed was pulling down six figures as a regional manager, but his spending pattern suggested he had access to a lot more money than his salary should have provided. The kind of money that might come from skimming construction budgets or inflating project costs. Your wife's been signing off on payments to dummy companies, Malcolm explained over the phone. Coleman & Sons Construction has been hemorrhaging money for months, and it all traces back to invoices your wife approved. The pieces fell in place like tumblers in a lock. Eleanor wasn't just cheating on me. She was stealing from her employer to fund her new lifestyle. The expensive clothes, the jewelry, the hotel rooms, even Dominic's Mercedes. All of it paid for with embezzled money. How much are we talking about? I asked. Conservative estimate? Around £200,000 over the past year. Could be more if they've been at it longer than I found evidence for. £200,000. Enough to destroy Frederick Coleman's business and land Eleanor in federal prison. Suddenly, my simple divorce had become something much more complicated. I spent the rest of the day thinking about what to do with this information. The smart move would be to document everything and use it as leverage in the divorce proceedings. But there was a part of me, the part that remembered the woman I'd married 28 years ago, that wanted to give her one last chance to come clean. That evening, Eleanor came home late again, claiming she'd been working on a big bid proposal. She was wearing another new outfit, a designer dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. When I complimented it, she gave me the same line about treating herself for working so hard. Eleanor, I said, following her upstairs to the bedroom. Is everything okay at work? You've been putting in a lot of hours lately. She paused in the middle of taking off her earrings. Expensive ones I'd never seen before. Why do you ask? Just seems like the construction business is keeping you busier than usual. Frederick must be grateful to have someone he can trust handling the finances. Something shifted in her expression just for a moment. Fear, maybe, or calculation, but then she smiled and went back to undressing. Frederick knows I'm dedicated, she said. Good employees are hard to find in this business. I nodded and went to take a shower, but my mind was racing. She was in deeper than I'd imagined. And when this all came out, the fallout was going to be devastating. Not just for our marriage, but for her freedom. As I stood under the hot water, I realized I was facing a choice. I could expose everything at once and watch her world collapse. Or I could try to save her from herself while still protecting my own interests. The problem was, I wasn't sure she deserved saving anymore. Beatrice Ellington called me at the shop on a Tuesday afternoon. Her voice shaky in a way I'd never heard before. Eleanor's mother was 76 years old and tougher than rawhide. So when she asked if she could come by to talk about something important, I knew it wasn't a social call. She arrived an hour later, looking older than her years, and carrying a manila envelope that she clutched like a lifeline. I poured her coffee in my office above the garage, the same office where I'd been planning my wife's downfall for weeks. Arthur, Beatrice said, settling into the worn leather chair across from my desk. I need to tell you something about Eleanor that I should have told you years ago. My stomach dropped. Whatever was in that envelope, I could tell it wasn't going to make my life any easier. Eleanor wasn't faithful to her first husband either, Beatrice continued, her voice barely above a whisper. Jeffrey caught her with his business partner. That's really why their marriage ended. not because they grew apart like she told everyone. Jeffrey Croft. I remembered him vaguely from Edward's childhood. A quiet man who'd moved to Spain after the divorce and rarely visited. Eleanor had always painted him as immature, unable to handle the responsibilities of marriage and fatherhood. There's more, Beatrice said, opening the envelope with trembling fingers. Jeffrey came to see me last month. He'd heard through mutual friends that Eleanor was married to you, and he wanted to warn you about what kind of person she really is. She handed me a letter written in careful handwriting. Jeffrey's account of his marriage to my wife was like reading the story of my own life, just with different dates and locations. The late nights at work, the mysterious credit card charges, the emotional distance that grew wider with each passing month. She destroyed that poor man, Beatrice said, wiping her eyes with a tissue. Took half of everything he'd worked for and left him broken. I swore I'd never let her do it to another good man. But I was too much of a coward to speak up when you two got married. I read the letter twice, absorbing every detail. Jeffrey described finding Eleanor with her lover in their own bed, the same bed where they conceived their son. He wrote about the divorce proceedings, how she'd accused him of abandonment and emotional abuse to get a larger settlement. Why are you telling me this now? I asked. Beatrice looked at me with tired eyes. Because history is repeating itself, and you deserve better than what she gave Jeffrey. You've been a good husband and father, Arthur. Don't let her destroy you like she did him. After Beatrice left, I sat in my office holding Jeffrey's letter and thinking about patterns. Eleanor hadn't changed. She'd just gotten better at hiding her true nature. The woman I'd married was the same woman who betrayed Jeffrey Croft, just older and more experienced at deception. That evening, I called Jeffrey in Spain. His voice was stronger than I'd expected. The voice of a man who'd survived betrayal and come out the other side intact. I wondered when this day would come, Jeffrey said after I introduced myself. How long have you known? A few weeks, I replied. Found her diary by accident. Diary. Jeffrey laughed, but there was no humor in it. She kept one during our marriage, too. Used to write terrible things about me, then leave it where I could find it. I think she wanted me to read it. We talked for over an hour, comparing notes on the woman we'd both married. Jeffrey had rebuilt his life in Spain, started a successful landscaping business, even remarried a few years back. But the scars from Eleanor's betrayal were still there. Barely healed wounds that probably always would hurt. Don't make the same mistakes I did. He warned me before hanging up. Document everything. Protect your assets. And don't believe a word she says during the divorce proceedings. She'll try to make you the villain, just like she did to me. The text message came at 3 o'clock in the morning, jarring me out of restless sleep. Eleanor's phone was buzzing on the nightstand, the screen lighting up the dark bedroom. She was dead asleep beside me, probably exhausted from another evening of living her double life. Car trouble on Highway 23. Can you come get me, D? I stared at the message for a long moment, then quietly got out of bed and went downstairs to my workshop. Dominic Reed needed rescuing, and my wife was too tired from their affair to hear her phone. The irony would have been funny if it wasn't so pathetic. But this gave me an opportunity one hadn't expected. I got dressed, grabbed my keys, and drove toward Highway 23, not to help Dominic, but to see what kind of trouble he'd gotten himself into. I found a black Mercedes on the shoulder about 10 miles outside town. Hazard lights blinking in the pre-dawn darkness. Dominic was standing beside it, talking on his phone, gesturing angrily at whoever was on the other end. I pulled over about 100 yards away and watched through binoculars I kept in my truck for hunting. The Mercedes had front-end damage consistent with hitting a deer or some other large animal. But what caught my attention was the way Dominic kept looking around nervously, like he was expecting someone to show up. This wasn't just car trouble. This was something else entirely. 20 minutes later, a tow truck arrived. Not from any local company I recognized, but from a service out of Birmingham. The driver and Dominic talked briefly, then loaded the Mercedes onto the flatbed. As they drove away, I followed at a safe distance. The tow truck didn't head toward any legitimate repair shop. Instead, it went to an industrial area on the outskirts of town, pulling into a warehouse complex that was supposed to be empty. I parked across the street and watched as several men came out to examine the damaged car. Something was very wrong here. This looked less like an accident and more like a cleanup operation. I took photos with my phone, making sure to capture license plates and faces, then called Malcolm Shaw. "You need to see this," I told him when he answered on the second ring. "Bring your camera and meet me at the old Miller Warehouse complex on Industrial Drive." Malcolm arrived 30 minutes later, just as the damaged Mercedes was being pushed into the warehouse. We watched from his car as men in coveralls began working on the vehicle, but not like mechanics fixing collision damage. They were methodical, professional, like they'd done this kind of work before. "What do you think they're doing?" I whispered. "Hard to say," Malcolm replied, adjusting his telephoto lens. "But whatever it is, they don't want anyone to know about it. That's not accident repair. That's evidence disposal." We stayed until sunrise, documenting everything. The warehouse, the license plates, the faces of the men working on the car. Malcolm even managed to get photos through the open bay doors showing them dismantling parts of the Mercedes' front end. "Your wife's boyfriend is into some serious trouble," Malcolm said as we finally drove away. "This isn't just an affair anymore, Art. This is criminal activity." When I got home, Eleanor was in the kitchen making coffee, still in her robe. She looked tired, but not particularly worried about her missing lover. "You're up early," she said without looking at me. "Couldn't sleep," I replied, which was true enough. "Everything okay? You seemed restless last night." She glanced at her phone, probably checking for messages from Dominic. Finding none, she shrugged and went back to her coffee. "Just work stress," she said. "Nothing I can't handle." I nodded and went upstairs to shower. But my mind was racing. Whatever Dominic Reed was involved in, it was bigger than embezzlement and adultery. And my wife was right in the middle of it, whether she knew it or not. The diary sat open on Eleanor's pillow, exactly as I planned, displaying those damning words for anyone to see. "I don't feel anything for him anymore." Right on top of it, I placed my wedding ring and the divorce papers I'd spent weeks perfecting. The house was quiet when she came home from what she claimed was another late meeting. I heard her footsteps on the stairs, then silence, then a scream that probably woke half the neighborhood. I was in my workshop when she came rushing down, still in her business clothes, but disheveled, tears streaming down her face. "Art, please, we need to talk," she said, holding the diary like evidence at a crime scene. "This isn't what you think." "It's exactly what I think," I replied, not looking up from the carburetor I was rebuilding. 28 years, Eleanor. 28 years I gave you everything I had. And you threw it away for some construction company embezzler who's probably going to prison. Her face went white. "How do you know about?" "I know everything," I said, finally meeting her eyes. "The money you've been stealing with Dominic Reed, the warehouse where he disposes of evidence. Your pattern of destroying good men who loved you. Jeffrey Croft sends his regards, by the way." She collapsed into the chair across from my workbench, the fight going out of her like air from a punctured tire. "Art, I never meant for it to go this far. It just happened." "Nothing just happens, Eleanor. You made choices. Every hotel room, every lie, every pound you stole from Frederick Coleman's company, you chose all of it." Malcolm Shaw's evidence was already in the hands of both the National Crime Agency and Eleanor's employer. Her accomplice, Dominic, was facing federal charges for fraud and racketeering. The warehouse operation we discovered was part of a larger scheme involving stolen construction materials and insurance fraud. "What happens to Edward's wedding?" she asked. And for a moment, she sounded like the woman I'd married decades ago. "Edward's wedding will be beautiful," I said. "Victoria and I have already made arrangements to help with the planning." "Victoria?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "My attorney also happens to be someone who knew me before I became too simple for complicated feelings." The next morning, Eleanor was gone, packed what she could carry, and left before dawn, probably trying to get ahead of the federal investigators who were closing in. She left a note on the kitchen table claiming she was going to stay with her sister until things got sorted out. But things weren't going to get sorted out. Frederick Coleman's construction company was bankrupt thanks to her embezzlement. Dominic Reed was in federal custody awaiting trial, and Eleanor was a fugitive from justice who destroyed everyone who'd ever tried to love her. Edward called that afternoon, having heard from his grandmother about the divorce. His voice was shaky, but he was trying to be strong. "Dad, I'm sorry," he said. "I had no idea Mom was capable of something like this." "Neither did I, son, but we'll get through it. Your wedding is going to happen exactly as planned, and your old man is going to be there smiling like the proud father I am." 6 months later, I walked Edward and Clara down the aisle at the country club wedding Eleanor had planned, but would never see. Victoria sat in the front row wearing a blue dress that brought out her eyes. And when she smiled at me during the ceremony, I remembered what it felt like to be appreciated by a woman who understood that simple didn't mean worthless. The courtroom was packed when Eleanor finally faced justice 18 months later. They found her in Lisbon, living under a false name and working at a hotel under the table. Dominic Reed had already been sentenced to 8 years in federal prison. Frederick Coleman's construction company had gone under, costing 47 people their jobs. I sat in the back row, not out of spite, but because I wanted to see the end of the story I'd helped write. Eleanor looked older, worn down by months of running and hiding. When the judge sentenced her to 6 years for fraud and embezzlement, she finally looked in my direction. I nodded once, not cruelly, but with the satisfaction of a man who'd protected himself and others from a predator. Edward and Clara's first anniversary was coming up, and they were expecting their first child. Clara had asked me to walk her down the aisle when her own father couldn't make it due to surgery, and I'd been honored to fill that role. Victoria and I have been dating for 8 months, taking things slow and building something real. She understood that trust was something I'd have to learn all over again, and she was patient with my cautious heart. The auto shop was thriving. Word had spread about how I'd helped bring down a criminal enterprise, and somehow that translated into more customers who respected a man who stood up for what was right. I'd hired 2 new mechanics and was thinking about expanding into the building next door. On quiet evenings, I sometimes thought about the diary entry that had changed my life. "I don't feel anything for him." Those words had hurt when I first read them, but now I understood they were a gift. They'd freed me from a marriage that was slowly killing my soul. Eleanor had been right about one thing. We were different people than when we'd first married, but the difference wasn't that I'd become simple or boring. The difference was that she'd become someone who could only find happiness by destroying other people's lives. I'd learned to feel again, to trust again, to build something real with someone who appreciated the man I'd always been. And that was worth more than all the pain it had taken to get there. The last I heard, Jeffrey Croft had remarried, too, to a widow who ran a flower shop in Malaga. We exchanged Christmas cards now, 2 survivors who'd found peace after the storm. Sometimes the best thing that can happen to a good man is discovering he's married to the wrong woman. It hurts like hell, but it opens up possibilities you never knew existed.